It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and of course, as always, that means some smart talk radio is in your future, and today a subject that we have touched on from time to time, not at great length, and we're probably remiss in doing that. We're going to be talking specifically about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, with a guy that is very familiar with it, has made a career out of working on that subject. His name is Michael Butner. We call him Mike. He's the founder of the Post-Traumatic Reintegration Process. He's also a PTSD specialist, a medical field expert, and professional caretaker for victims of war, acts of terrorism, and natural disasters. And we will find out quite a bit, I'm sure. Mike, how are you, my friend?
I'm just fine, sir.
Well, we're very pleased to have you here. Let's do this. Let's, once and for all, for our Lewis at Large audience, if you would, define what PTSD is and its origins and why this is so important to you in particular.
PTSD is actually a term that is just used to define or to describe a series of symptoms. That the symptoms involve usually feelings of hypervigilance, fear, sometimes flashbacks, anxiety, and these things are stimulated or caused by some traumatic event that has threatened the individual.
And why, in your particular case, Mike, why the unique interest here?
Well, the unique interest for me started as a child. My father was a veteran of the Korean War, and I grew up with an individual who suffered from these problems. And so I've lived with it through my lifetime.
Describe maybe for our listeners, if you would, a little bit how being in that environment, what was different, and tell us how you sort of coped with all of that.
Well, the circumstances, I guess, as growing up is that there was always a sense of anxiety and a sense of brooding anger and a feeling of anxiety that we grew up with in the family. My dad's unit was the first unit to go into Korea, and his unit was destroyed, and he really never got over that. So that basically gave me a certain way of wondering why was Dad the way he was. And through the years, I kind of got more involved in trying to figure out why.
At this particular point in time, how versed and how on top of this do you believe the medical and maybe the psychiatric community is on this, and how far have we come with this?
Well, as I said, PTSD is just a term that describes symptoms. It indicates an underlying problem. It's just, you can think of it conceptually as being the same as having a fever. If you have a fever, it can come from a lot of different things, infection, illness, and where we are now in the medical world is we're treating the fever with Tylenol or an antipyretic, ibuprofen, for example. We're really not focusing on what the problem is or what the process is that is underlying all this.
So again, and I know PTSD is again a descriptive term that covers probably a wide variety of particular situations. But again, as far as, and again, I'll just start with the military, but the military and the government in general, A, research, B, resources, and help. Where do you think?
Well, research is basically not actually all that notable at this point. Resources are limited. Not a third of all military personnel will be treated in their lifetime by the VA. 2/3 will be treated by non-military type caregivers who feel basically disconnected from the military world, and very few of those civilian caregivers understand anything about combat or that type of conflict. So there's a fundamental disconnect In the military, individuals say if you weren't there, you can't know, and that's actually not true, but it is a concept that is biasing everyone.
What, again, tell us a little bit about the groups. And again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're talking to Mike Butner, who is one of America's leading experts on dealing with PTSD, has worked with numerous groups and lots of people across the country about this. Mike, share with us a little bit about some of the specific work that you do.
What I do at this point is that I'm in the process of trying to educate medical providers, particularly civilian providers, on how to identify and how to set up treatment programs for individuals who suffer PTSD. And that's this process that we've defined called post-traumatic reintegration. Through the years, we've been able to define that PTSD is a set of symptoms. The reintegration comes in 5 stages, and different types of individuals tend to go through the stages at different rates or in different ways. So by putting those two concepts together, we can actually give substance to the ability to put together a treatment program for the individual.
So you work with all different kinds of citizen groups. Do you work specifically with any that are uniquely from the military or from particular kinds of occupations?
Well, through the years, I've spent a pretty fair amount of time going around to, for example, National Guard armories, particularly for those units that have been deployed, and I have gone in to try to prepare the families for the return of their troops. I've done a fair amount of work specifically around certain Army bases to try to prepare the family members for what's going to be coming back. Did a lot of that around Rolla, Missouri, which is around Fort Leonard Wood, which is the main military training center for combat engineers. And those are the folks that disarmed the roadside bombs. So I've done a lot of work with those folks. More recently, I've worked with the section of psychiatric workers of the state of Minnesota, the University of Minnesota School of Medicine, the University of Colorado School of Medicine, and various medical education groups to try to bring doctors and nurse practitioners up to speed on what this whole problem is. Of course, through the years, I've always been connected to the VA.
Yeah, and what kind of cooperation do you get there at the VA?
A lot of lip service and not too many resources. They basically are overrun and burdened by their own bureaucracy, so they're not very efficient. They try, but the system is burdened with bureaucracy.
Mike, any estimates at all of the number of people in the United States right now that are dealing with this issue?
Well, honestly, it's everybody, because we talk about post-combat PTSD, but if you talk specifically about the U.S. military, 1% of the population is connected now actively in service. If you take extended family from that, you're dealing with about 15% of the population. But the fact is, trauma and all that goes with PTSD is a universal phenomenon, and it affects the entire population. And so those of us that even witness natural calamities, those that are involved in events with violence in our different cities or countryside, all of us are basically victimized by it.
And I assume with the continued proliferation of media, social and electronic and news media and otherwise, awareness of these events is growing more than ever before as well.
The awareness is growing, and that actually some of us feel, and this is controversial, but some of us feel that the significant publicity that's given to these events is actually causing the events to propagate.
Yeah, understood. Almost copycat kind of events. What again, with the people that you work with, and again, I know it's not limited to the military. That's probably a stereotype that probably should have been sort of banished quite a while ago. But what about those that have this, that are dealing with this? And again, you're saying it's pretty widespread. Is there any particular unique characteristics as far as those that are male versus female, young versus old, et cetera, anything like that?
No, it's a universal phenomenon. You can think of it as simply, I wish we had taken PTSD and had renamed it extended grief. Because what PTSD is, it's a series of symptoms and reactions that happen to a loss of personal security or personal identity. And it's the same recovery process is required to go through that you have to go through in the grief process.
Are there any particular, as we talk to our listeners here, are there any particular symptoms, and we want to be careful here to not sound too alarmist, but are there any particular symptoms or actions or behavior that friends, family, loved ones, coworkers, et cetera, should be aware of?
In the world of post-traumatic reintegration, it's a model for evaluation and treatment. In that model, there are 4 kinds of people. There are people who are orientated towards mission, people who are orientated towards purpose, people who are orientated towards themselves, and then there are finally the selfless people who are orientated towards others. All of those different people go through the 5 stages of reintegration at different rates and tend to get stuck at different places. Since we have so much publicity now about violent events, the 4th group, those who are the selfless individuals, actually are the ones who are most likely to become either victims of violence or perpetrators of violence. So if someone is known to be that type of person and they have a disintegration or a change, negative change in their personal family environment, those are the ones who are most likely to have tendencies towards violence. People who are orientated towards mission, and in the civilian world, you could say these people are the professional people, the people who get some sort of sense of gratification out of whatever it is that they're doing. Those are the ones who tend to get trapped in substance abuse and those types of escapist or denial type of treatment traps. So one has to be very careful, particularly as a practitioner, not to over-medicate these people, because you can actually basically facilitate their decline and be treating them totally in a damaging way. People who are orientated towards purpose, those are actually normal people. People who work for a living don't necessarily define themselves by what they're doing, whether that's in the military or in the civilian world. They frequently get trapped in depression and frequently can be helped a great deal by counseling and specific medications. So this whole process is one that you have to be able to identify the personality type and then understand the 5 stages and to see where the traps are.
Are you finding that more and more of the medical community and the psychiatric or the mental health community is focusing time, energy, and resources towards this, or is not much changing in this field?
There's a lot of lip service, but not much is being done.
How many Mike Butners are there out there doing similar work to you? I mean, is there any kind of an organized effort or a network of some kind of help providers at all?
Not really. Not in my experience. I travel around the country. I give lectures at different parts of the country, different medical groups, different universities, and there's really not much of a network. It's really kind of sad, and I wish that there was.
Is the society in general, are we in denial as to the magnitude of this, or are we just not educated enough? Why isn't this, if it is as you say, why aren't we more alarmed or at least aware of what's going on here?
We live in a society now that is very fragmented. It used to be, at least conceptually when I was growing up, I thought that, well, yes, we're different, but we're Americans, or we have some sense of commonality. As societies become more fragmented, now we're a society of more special interest groups, and we can give a long litany. I'm pro this, I'm anti that. I'm pro this, I'm anti that. And we tend to become more isolated in our views, and as we have become so, we really have become less connected. The more wired we are, the less connected we are as far as being able to relate to other people. It's a symptom of our society at this point.
Again, we're talking to Mike Butler. I don't know where I'm getting that one. Mike Butner, rather. He is the founder of the Post-Traumatic Reintegration Process, PTSD specialist, and also a professional caretaker for victims of war, acts of terrorism, and natural disasters here. And Mike, why don't you share with us a little bit about the whole P-TRIP, this sort of post-traumatic reintegration process. Share a little bit about some of the factors and some of the qualities of that program.
Well, again, we've been able to identify that after the initial trauma, and that can be combat, that can be a bank robbery, that can be a tornado, that can be a physical assault in a parking lot, whatever the trauma is, the idea is that the patient's survival, sense of identity, sense of innocence, sense of who they are has been violated and something has been taken away from them. In the aftermath of that, people go through a type of processing in their psyches. The first stage of the process is shock. Literally, you're just numb. You are just in shock over what has happened. This is an emotional reaction. The second stage, when you get through the shock stage, is denial. And denial can be simply that I'm not going to think about that right now. I'm going to put it on the shelf, or I've got to complete the mission. I got to complete the job. I've got to finish this up. So I take my emotions that are inside, overseeing my buddy just getting blown up by this bomb, that I'll just put that aside and I'll focus on the mission. Whether it's in a military, police, civilian setting, that's denial. Those people sometimes, frequently, get trapped with their beer drinking, their substance use. Sometimes they become workaholics. Sometimes they have other behaviors, and they just never do really face up to what has happened. That was what my father did. Very hard, just almost a John Wayne type figure, using that in a kind of a parlance kind of way. Never would get past that stage of denial. The third stage is basically a type of bargaining. So an individual says, okay, I was involved in whatever this was. I'm going to try to win back some of my innocence. I will become a caregiver. I will become a dedicated charitable type person, a philanthropist. I will do something to try to buy back some sense of value for myself. The fourth stage is actually depression. Psychiatrists define depression as anger turned inward. Frequently, that is what it is. Sometimes anger gets turned outward, and that's where you can get violent behaviors, mostly towards self, but sometimes towards others. The fifth stage, the one that we're trying to get people to, is self-forgiveness. And that's where you actually cope with the fact, yep, it happened, and people forgive themselves. A common example of this is that a small child who experiences a loss of a parent or a brother or a sister, in their minds, they will somehow blame themselves for what has happened. If I were a better child, my parents would still be married. If I had been a better brother or sister, my sibling would still be alive or wouldn't have been hurt. We always blame ourselves. The woman who's been accosted on the street, she may not be able to verbalize that, but as part of her psyche will say, okay, if I had dressed differently, acted differently, been in a different part of town, I wouldn't have been attacked, and she will blame herself. And our society frequently puts that burden on individuals, saying they were somehow responsible for their own injury. We work through that, and we get to the point of self-forgiveness. And that's what caregivers who are versed in the reintegration process are trying to help people get through. There's no pill for PTSD. We have to heal from it. And when we heal from it, we are different at the end than we were at the beginning. When I give different lectures, I tell people sometimes, particularly military families, you started off as iron, but after you've been through the fire of combat, you will end up as steel. Different, more durable, but different. And that's what the process is all about.
Well, it is a subject that is one that has been on the forefront, and fortunately, people like Mike Butner are working very hard to raise not only awareness of PTSD, but are also actively working to take care of those and help those that are victims of this. Mike, before we get out of here today, how can people find out more specifically about the work you do and specifically about PTSD?
Well, there are several texts that are out there and are written. These can be obtained frequently from the libraries that are maintained by, for example, the National Guard Armories. They have a list that is available for reading. My particular book is a military novel that I wrote to educate military spouses on how to prepare for the return of their loved one from the field. It's called A Tour of Duty. It is subtitled The Third Prince, the Mitchell Rice story. It's available from Amazon. There are different articles that are now going to be published as the year goes on in different magazines, USA Today, etc., that will try to give more of a populist type of view of what we're talking about.
Okay. Well, again, we certainly appreciate the work that you do and shedding some light on this important subject of PTSD, and best of luck to you in the future, my friend.
I appreciate you having me on the air. Thank you.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large. You love your dog and you love your yard, but sometimes what your dog leaves behind can make you not love your yard so much. Well, when that happens, it's Call of Duty Pet Waste Removal Service to the rescue. Large or small dogs, big yard or small, call Call of Duty. They clean up the mess your dog leaves behind. So if you're tired of cleaning pet waste from your yard, call Call of Duty, 764-7224. That's 764-7224. Prompt, effective, courteous services on the way. Your yard is left clean and waste-free. So don't waste any more time on waste. Call Call of Duty in Lawrence, 764-7224. That's 764-7224. Or visit their website, callofduty2010.web.com.